Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Germany's relationship with Russia has rested on a belief of dialogue, trade, and the idea that closer economic ties could foster political stability. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine shattered that belief, forcing a profound reassessment of the assumptions that guided Berlin's policy toward Moscow for decades. In their book, Das Versagen, The Failure, journalists Katja Gloger and Georg Mascolo investigated how political leaders, intelligence services, and major industries misread the Kremlin's intentions, missing signals that now seem almost unmistakable. Their work offers an inside look at how those choices were made and what they mean for Europe's security today. We're joined by one of the book's authors, as well as a leading US expert on Russia, to explore the questions raised by Das Versagen, including questions like, how did Germany's Russia policy go wrong? What lessons can Europe draw as it confronts a more dangerous world? And what might a realistic framework for future engagement look like? I'm delighted to welcome investigative journalist and author Katja Gloger. She served as Moscow bureau chief for Stent magazine and witnessed the fall of the Soviet Union and the emergence of a new Russia. Her focus has been on Russia, international affairs, and security policy. And in addition to her latest book, she's published several books on Russia, including one called Putin's World, The New Russia, Ukraine, and the West. Katja, herzlich willkommen.
Thank you so much for having me. A good morning to New York after an exciting day yesterday, wasn't it?
Well, we are delighted to have you, and I am equally delighted to welcome ACG Young Leader alumna, Dr. Angela Stent. She is professor emerita, sorry about that, professor emerita at Georgetown University, and has also been a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, but she is currently a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and also the author of a number of books on Russia and on Vladimir Putin. Angela, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm glad to be back on your show.
It is wonderful to have you both here. Katja, Das Versagen, it is number 3 on Spiegel's bestseller list. I was astounded to hear that it is already sold out in some places 3 weeks after publication, and that the 5th edition is already in print. So there are a lot of people who are really interested in the book that you and Georg Mascolo have put together. In that book, you make the case that many of the warning signs about Russia's intentions were either not seen or ignored by German policymakers. And I'd like to start by asking you to share some of the most striking examples and why you think these early warning signs were overlooked.
Sure, this will keep us busy another 3 hours trying to answer this question. I'm so delighted to have the chance to talk to you and to discuss the issue with Angela, who I admire so much as a person and as a professional, and for her work, certainly. Germany and Russia, as you know, is a long and complicated story. Germany and German politicians understood themselves for a long time as those who would understand the Soviet Union and then later on Russia best, given common history, but also given the responsibility for World War II, the war of annihilation against the peoples of the Soviet Union. And then certainly following the tradition of Ostpolitik, Eastern policy, how can you foster change through getting together, through dialogue. So this was always a German tradition to be a country understanding Russia better than maybe others. And in this tradition, if you want so, Vladimir Putin, when he became president in the year 2000, he was seen as someone who could follow this tradition from the Russian side. And this was, in my eyes, in our eyes, one of the early strategic misreadings of Vladimir Putin. We thought that there is another Putin, that there is a Putin who wants to build democracy, who wants to build a kind of social market economy in his own country, and that therefore he would need Germany as a reliable and stable economical and political partner. So the so-called other Putin was on people's minds for many, many years. And all this was kind of sealed with the stamp of the personal friendship between the German Chancellor Gerd Schröder and Vladimir Putin himself.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, since you mentioned Chancellor Schröder, I guess the question that I sort of have is where do you see the fault? Is this sort of the fault of individuals, people who were in roles of responsibility, like the Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, or the intelligence services, or is it part of sort of a broader structural or systematic failure? I mean, I think this notion of the other Putin sounds like a widespread thought that might have been shared by many individuals, but was there also an underlying structural issue at play here?
But if you look at, I mean, if you do the reality check, right from the beginning, the reality check looked quite different. Putin was never the maybe a little bit authoritarian Democrat we wanted him to be. If you look at domestic policy, right when he became president, it was obvious and seen and could be seen for everybody. The war in Chechnya he waged, repressions against the last, so say, independent media, the power structures of KGB people he surrounded himself with. There were people in Russia saying when Putin came to power in 2000, and it was not a real democratic election, if you recall, the KGB came to power with him. And this, I think, we underestimated strategically. We thought there would be a common way forward, a way forward together.
Mm-hmm. Let me bring Angela in at this point. I mean, Angela, you, of course, have also written a lot about Putin. I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on this other Putin and some of the expectations that people had. I mean, certainly in one of your recent books titled Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest, you really explore his sort of mindset and the kinds of alliances that he was building. From your standpoint, where is this tension between the other Putin and the reality check that Katja was talking about?
So first of all, let me say that I'm reading Katja and Georg's book, and it's a very interesting read, and I'm learning a lot from it. So when Putin first came into power, I remember someone who was working on the National Security Council at that point in the United States saying, to the question, who is Vladimir Putin? And there were three possible answers. There was Putin, the economic modernizer, looking at what he had done in St. Petersburg, Putin the spook, the KGB, and then Putin the empty suit. So when he first came to power, people didn't really know that much about him, but he appeared to be, young, sober, a man who wanted to lead Russia forward. So, and he seemed to be pragmatic. He had these conversations at the beginning with the head of the World Bank, with other people, and he made it sound as if he was interested in economic integration with the West. And of course, he'd had the experience in the 1990s of being responsible for economic relations with foreign businesses in foreign countries in St. Petersburg. And so he took some of that with him. And I think that the KGB background and people understood that's where he came from, but they were willing maybe to suspend their judgment and in the beginning take him at his word. And I think in the US at least, and this obviously was a different case than Germany, what was important was after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York, Putin being the first foreign leader to reach President Bush. And then together, there was this high point in the fall of 2001 when the Russians sort of helped the US in its campaign against Afghanistan. Putin visited Washington. He went to George Bush's ranch in Texas, and it seemed as if there was really going to be this kind of pragmatic cooperation because we had a common enemy, which was terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism. So I think in the US case, there was also the wish, I think, that this was the other Putin, that this was the Putin who was willing to cooperate with the West, and that together a better relationship could be formed. And I will just say again, this is more true of the US than of Germany, because obviously Germany has a much longer and complicated relationship with Russia. But you had in every single administration in the US after the collapse of the Soviet Union, whether they were Democratic or Republican presidents, believing that they could reset relations with Russia, that there was a better way to interact with Russia, that they could find, if you like, the golden key to doing this. And when Putin came in, there was optimism about this.
And he came in,
Yeah.
Angela, if I might add, he came in with that promise that he could really fix things. And this impressed. This is what we heard from many interviews we made, talks we had with people who were witnesses of political meetings at the time, that this was something that impressed people very much, that there was, this hands-on, very sober, as you said, young Russian president who wanted kind of to learn from the Western experience, and at the same time had this really pragmatic, let's get to work, I get things done approach concerning his own country. And this the promise that he would stabilize the chaos of the 90s and thereby not only foster good economical relations between Russia and Europe, between Russia and Germany, but also show ways towards a better future for the Russian people, which was true at the time. I mean, the Russian people were never better off than during the first years of Putin's presidency. And it was not only Gucci or Armani or so that who went to Moscow. People started to travel. They started to build a future. So all this added to the picture. This is somebody we can, we can not only make deals with, but we can build a good and sound relationship with.
Yeah, and I think you're quite right. You said pragmatic. Everybody thought that Putin was pragmatic. And I think that, I mean, I'm sure we'll come to this. And this is why people were so shocked about what happened in February 2022, because people thought that he was risk averse and pragmatic. But I would also say the reason why Russians were so much better off in the first term of Putin and the second term too was because of rising oil prices. I mean, Russia reaped the benefits of that, and so people's standard of living rose. And even people who became opponents of the system will say we were much better off in those first years of the 2000s, and in that sense, Putin delivered, even though, by 2004, you'd already had the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and things were already beginning to become more repressive. But certainly people's standard of living and their way of life improved.
I mean, I think in many ways, what you're talking about and that period that you're talking about was built on sort of the tenets of Wandel durch Handel, or change through trade, and really the desire to create a partnership with Russia. Certainly in the sort of post-Soviet era, and so I'd be interested in hearing from each of you, maybe Katja, from you first, about how some of what you and Georg found in your research for the book really sort of challenges those prevailing narratives of Wandel durch Handel and partnership, and where there was really a turning point in German policy toward Russia.
I mean, when we started to talk to people, so many were not only shocked, but had no explanation, no real explanation after February 24th, 2022. We found that there were a lot of critical voices in the German administration, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in the Chancellery. There were critical voices right from the beginning. We remember talking to the former State Secretary Klaus Schariot. He was political director in the Foreign Office at the time. He died just last week.
A few days ago, yeah.
He went to see Putin as one of the first German high-level people in a ministry. And this was beginning of 2000. And he came back with a few notes he had made that, this guy is a very cold, cynical KGB operator, in a sense. You do not want to be friends with him. There were lots of critics and reports on the so-called Petersburg Camarilla, on this kind of mafia state or system that Putin had built in Petersburg in the 90s already, and then kind of took it over to Moscow. So it's not that that German politicians, also German businessmen, were blind, or romantic. The problem is that these critics were not heard in the German Chancellery under Chancellor Schröder, but also later on. And this is where it gets really interesting in my eyes, for 16 years under Chancellor Merkel. I mean, Angela Merkel, with her biography, being, raised in the former GDR, with all her experience, knowing what kind of character
Yeah.
are people from the secret services. She also went along with this pragmatic approach. Let's keep a dialogue, let's keep good economical relations. And this is how we as a German government, this is how we could try to hedge Putin, kind of to rein him in with his obsessions. And these obsessions were quite clear quite early on. We're talking Ukraine 2004, we are talking Ukraine 2008, and so on. Yeah.
So related to that, where do you see sort of the real turning point in the German view of Russia? And did you discover sort of a shift in policy, or did that only come with the renewed attack on Ukraine?
I mean, we all
and the
thought,
full-scale war, right? I mean, the truly the
we
full-scale.
all, yeah, would be interesting to hear Angela's experience there. We all thought after the annexation of Crimea and after MH17, when people were falling from the sky dead, literally, 289, 98, I'm sorry, people shot down over eastern Ukraine in July 2014. We thought that this could be a turning point. And it's true. I mean, Angela Merkel went to the EU. She helped to get, sanctions on the way, and at the same time, this is kind of one of the miracles, if you might say so. At the same time, when she negotiated the so-called Minsk II agreement, it was a kind of peace agreement to freeze, not to end, but to freeze the conflict, the war in eastern Ukraine. At the same time, the pipeline Nord Stream 2 gets started. At the same time, Gazprom gets even more power and monopoly over gas deliveries into Germany. So the thinking was, if we want to freeze the war in eastern Ukraine, then we have to give Putin Nord Stream 2. This is interrelated. Then we rather not support Ukraine militarily with delivery of weapons or training of soldiers. Germany was, until the very end, very, very reluctant to do so. We delivered musical instruments from the Bundeswehr. This is what we did in order to supply the Ukraine military orchestra. So in the very end, the turning point was only in February 22. I fear I have to say.
And I guess, Angela, you've spent a lot of time in your career following German-Soviet relations, and then later in the post-Cold War era relations between Germany and Russia. How would you sort of characterize this evolution of German policy toward Russia from the 1990s to today? Do you see things somewhat differently from Katja's assessment, or similarly?
So I'm going to go back to Willy Brandt for a moment, because my first book that I published looked at the way that the West German government had tried to use economic incentives to get concessions from the Soviet Union on the German question, on a relation between the two Germanys. So you have Wandel durch Handel, change through trade, and then Wandel durch Annäherung, which is again change through rapprochement. And if you go back to that period, you can make an argument that worked. That in fact Germany, West Germany began importing Soviet gas in 1970. There were closer and closer economic relations. And of course, relations between the two Germanys then did improve, and eventually, you got German unification. So I think once Germany is unified and the Soviet Union collapses, Germany felt a sense of obligation towards Russia because of, in fact, what Gorbachev had done, even though Gorbachev wasn't in power anymore, gratitude for German unification, and therefore economic incentives were used. The 1990s was a very difficult time economically, as Katja has already said. People were quite impoverished. So again, the belief that the more economic assistance Germany gave to Russia, the more maybe the relationship could stabilize. And of course, the economic interests were there. People were making money from their business relations with Russia. And, Russian gas was cheap and plentiful. So, increasing dependence on Russian gas. And then I think they're also, you have to go back into history again. And part of, I think, the German attitude towards Russia was still, the historical responsibility for World War II and for the deaths that the Soviet Union suffered there. But the mistake here was, if we fast forward, thinking that the obligation was to Russia and forgetting that when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, they invaded through Ukraine, and proportionally more Ukrainians died in World War II than Russians. So it was just focusing on Russia, if you like, as deserving of this German interaction and assistance and trade than Ukraine. Anyway, so those things were all there. And then I think the belief that dialogue for dialogue's sake was very important. And I think for the whole period until February 2022, that was one of the founding, if you like, principles of the way that Germany viewed Russia, that however difficult it was and however increasingly difficult it was to deal with Putin, that you had to continue a dialogue. And I think it took Germany quite long to understand that the more you trade with Russia, that's fine. But that from Putin's point of view, you decouple the economic from the political relationship, and improved economic relations did not lead to improved political relations. The Germans aren't the only country that sort of believed that were, I think, blinded by the reality there. I think you had people in the US and other European countries certainly believing that too. And so I think, and I think the paradox, and Katja's already said that, you had Chancellor Angela Merkel, and given her background and growing up in East Germany, she of all people, I think, understood who Putin was with all her dealings with him. And yet, Germany did still pursue a policy continually of trying to engage Russia and thinking that somehow they could limit the damage that Putin was doing.
And I mean, this leads to a question that we've sort of touched on that I wanted to ask both of you is really to talk a little bit more about the role that Germany's economic interests played in shaping the German government's Russia policy, right? It has to do, of course, with energy. That has been the big topic, but it also has to do with trade and investment more broadly.
Sure. Pressure from the German industry was persistent even after the annexation of Crimea, to move on, to go on, to start Nord Stream 2. The notion was, cheap gas, kind of 30% cheaper than LNG at the time. So this is what helps your profit margins grow, certainly. And the notion, okay, we build Nord Stream 2. This is what the Russians want. We give Ukraine a part of transition capacity, but in the very end, the big pipelines were supposed to go to Germany, and making Germany also a hub for European gas trade even more. It was not only the cheap prices, it was also an economical position within Europe. So this certainly was a reason, and this is what we heard again and again also in our when we talked to people in the government, how big the pressure from the German industry was. But in the very end, this is only one reason and one point to consider, and that we kind of it's difficult for me to find the right word. We did not neglect Ukraine after 2014, but Ukraine was not on the top of our political to-do list when it comes to policy towards the post-Soviet states. We looked at Ukraine also as with lots of suspicion. Corrupt state, not really democratic. We don't really know what they are up to. So why do we need to maybe equip them militarily or train their military? And it's also true that at the time, if I recall correctly, the Obama administration, at least Barack Obama himself, was not really willing to support Ukraine in a way that would have made Ukraine maybe stronger. Would it have prevented the full-scale war? Nobody really knows, but it would have been worth a try. Yeah.
Angela, do you have anything to?
Well, I think just on the economic, the energy was a major factor, obviously, in the German-Russian relationship, for all the reasons that Katja's already given, but also broader trade and investment, and I think Chancellor Merkel herself came under quite a lot of pressure from German industry to encourage business dealings with Russia. So in terms of Ukraine, I would agree. I mean, I think when many of the misgivings, let's say, that Germans may have had about Ukraine were very similar to the United States. Maybe the difference is in the US, we still have, we have a significant Ukrainian lobby, Ukrainian Americans, in a way that I think probably didn't exist in Germany, but they weren't able to affect certainly their Obama policy that much. And so in 2014, the US, President Obama gave an interview famously where he said Ukraine's an existential issue for Russia, and it's not an existential issue for the United States. This is something, of course, you hear now in the Trump administration too, but then, and therefore there's sort of a limit to what we can do. And I think and the same was true then after Obama in the Trump administration, although the Trump administration actually did supply Ukraine then with javelins, which the Obama administration had refused to do. But I think still this idea that Russia is the big country. If you're the US, it's the other nuclear superpower, and you have to deal with them. From Russia flows a kind of existential danger, which doesn't flow from countries like Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. So because of this, and we've touched on this, and Angela, you said that we would probably get to this later in the conversation, but I'd be really interested in hearing from both of you how you sort of tie some of these past policy decisions to the full-on outbreak of war in February of 2022. What's that connection? What's that trajectory?
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, well, I would just say, first of all, I'm coming back to the question of pragmatism, right? Most people believe, even though Putin got much more repressive, the situation in Russia got much more dire for people who didn't agree with the regime, and he got more difficult to deal with. in the US, and I think most Western countries and even, the people in the intelligence services believed that Putin was pragmatic and he was not a risk taker. And therefore, when the US intelligence agencies and other ones saw the buildup of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border prior to the full-scale invasion, even though they understood that that must mean more than just what what people initially thought was what Putin was interested in doing was, completing control over the Donbas region, right? Taking the whole of the Donbas and then leaving it. It would be a quote unquote limited invasion. And they couldn't really, the rationale why have a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And yet, in the end, of course, that happened. And even Bill Burns, the former CIA director, has said several times, we saw what was happening and we understood that was probably going to be the case, but we couldn't believe that Putin would really do it. So I think answering your question about how that feeds into the full-scale invasion, Putin looked at Europe before the invasion and he saw Germany, all of the economic interests in Russia, all of these ties, but other European countries too, but particularly Germany, they had such a vested interest in maintaining these economic ties with Russia that their reaction wouldn't be that strong. And of course, just before the invasion, you had France in the middle of elections. The situation in Britain was difficult. In Germany, you had a fairly new government. And then he looked at the United States and he saw a Biden administration that had conducted a fairly disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. He thought he'd met President Biden in June of 2021, but he thought that the US was kind of irresolute. He thought that the differences between the US and Europe were such that they couldn't get together. Of course, he also misjudged the ability of the Ukrainians to fight back and the pretty parlous state of the Russian armed forces at the time. He didn't understand their weakness. But I think the policies of both the Europeans, both the Germans and the US, led him to mistakenly believe that there wouldn't be much reaction to this invasion.
Mm-hmm.
And that everybody has a price, and that to put it a little bluntly, apparently that was the thinking in the Kremlin. And one proof that we have, or one little evidence that we have, is that for the research for the book, in the research for the book, we found a document dating September 22, so 6 months into the full-scale invasion, after Bucha. Putin sends the Russian ambassador to Germany, to the chancellery, with a paper. It reads about some problems of energy supply in Europe and in Germany. And over 6 pages, the paper explains that gas delivery, energy supply towards Europe is towards Germany is a little difficult because of all the sanctions, because of repairs of certain parts that cannot be done because of the sanctions. But fortunately and by chance, there is a major pipeline project, Nord Stream 2, ready and operational at the time, September 22. It was filled with gas. And could have been, set to flow within a very short amount of time. And the Russian proposal in September 22 towards the German government was, if you open Nord Stream 2, if you certify Nord Stream 2, our problem solved and gas can flow. So this shows, an attitude towards, another country where you think probably they can be bought off, with a couple of incentives. I think this was one thing that we kind of didn't see clearly enough. The nature of a system and of people of a power elite thinking that everybody has a price, everybody can be bought in the very end. And the second thing is, one of the people we talked to said it a little lightly. He said, probably we underestimated the issue of a dictator on a historical mission. The ideologization and radicalization of this man and the very few people around him, being in an historical conflict, if not war, with the West, taking revenge, rebuilding the Russian Empire, gathering the Slavic lands. And it's not by chance that Vladimir Putin refers to Peter the Great very often recently. So historical mission for a dictator, dangerous thing, you'd better watch out.
Katja, it was fascinating to hear you share this insight of some previously unavailable documents that you and Georg were able to access. I mean, obviously, some of the documents that you reviewed had been secret documents previously or archived, and you were able to sort of pore over those and assess those, and they fed into your analysis about the situation. Can you share some other documents that had that sort of aha effect for you, or that were significantly insightful?
Oh, there's certainly many we gathered over time. Certainly all the thousands and thousands of pages related to Nord Stream 2. It would take too long to get into the details, but these papers, protocols, they show that the so-called private business of building a major gas pipeline called Nord Stream 2, which certainly was not only a business thing, it was a political issue, a geostrategic issue right from the beginning, that the German government did almost everything to try to get this done. And if you look into the papers over the years, it's really astonishing, and to be honest, also a little frustrating that against all opposition, EU Parliament was against, the Eastern European partners were screaming that this pipeline is a dangerous issue. But it's sometimes it seemed, like they didn't want to hear, and this is frustrating as a citizen. Other documents Angela mentioned in the beginning, the real background of the famous so-called historical speech of Vladimir Putin in the German Bundestag in 2001, when he came and spoke German. And everybody was excited and wanted to see the European in and even the German in Putin.
There was a lot of symbolism around that speech.
Oh, a lot, really. But as we looked into the documents, it showed that the Bundestag, right in the beginning, was very much against Vladimir Putin having a speech, delivering a speech in the German Bundestag, because it's an honor only for very, very few people. And then, the discussion went on for months and months, and in the very end, Chancellor Schröder intervened and said, I want Putin to speak. And then there were two conditions made by the German Bundestag. Okay, if Putin speaks, then please, he has to deliver major parts of his speech in German. It's not that he wanted to, to speak in German, but it was a condition the German Bundestag had. This is just one little example, and the other one that two politically very well connected and quite important people at the time, that they were asked by the Kremlin, by the Putin administration, to deliver their thoughts and remarks about the content of this historical speech. One of them was Horst Teltschik, former national security advisor to Chancellor Kohl, who had apparently formulated the sentence that Russia is a friendly European country, that Putin then pronounced during the speech. And the other one was Klaus Mangold from the German Eastern Business Association, very influential businessman. He especially went to Moscow in order to discuss the economical part of the speech, and his thoughts were taken as part of this speech as well. So in a sense, at least parts of this speech, the Germans wrote for themselves.
I'm wondering, because of course there's part of that speech also said Russia and Germany have all this history, we're closely bound together, we don't have those kind of contacts with the United States, they're far away, so
yes,
it'd be interesting to see who put that in the speech.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, fascinating to think about, a head of state having sections of their speech being written by senior security staff from another country. I find that quite amazing, quite an interesting find. So, with a view to the clock and where we are, and indeed we could have spent much more time together, I'd like to spend a few minutes sort of looking to the future, right? We've seen this evolving position from Russia. We've seen greater conflict, particularly as exemplified by the war in Ukraine. One of the questions that I have is how well Germany has adapted or is adapting its Russia policy toolkit, if you will, to respond to this, but also what lessons policymakers in Germany and elsewhere should draw from the past decade of engaging with Russia and with Putin. I guess, Katja, maybe the first question to you of to what degree is this new government in Berlin adapting its Russlandpolitik based on the current circumstances and the lessons learned? And then, Angela, what some of the lessons are that policymakers can draw and how that might shape future policies?
All right. So the Zeitenwende, in a way, is there. I think today many wish that there would have been or should have been more smaller Zeitenwenden before than one big at a time, because now we have to deal with all the major problems related to that major shift that occurred in February 22. So it's not only how to rebuild a Bundeswehr and find young people to sign up. You follow the discussion on the law. It's how to build resilience. I know it's a kind of fashion, it's a buzzword, but nevertheless, I think it's true. So how do you build resilience in a society facing many other problems, economical problems, financial restraints? So this is a topic, for major problem within German society. We have important elections coming up in the Eastern Bundesländer next year, and you've been following the polls. The rightist, populist, extremist, the AfD, is winning and winning and winning in the polls, at least. When it comes to Russia, I think the lesson is learned in a sense that you really need to toughen up to a dictator on a historical mission. Which he is, because he wages war against the West. How do we cope with all the problems related to Ukraine, financial support, ongoing military support, thinking about maybe reconstruction at some point, at some day, and how to support Ukraine finding a way into the European Union, because NATO, Angela, you correct me if I'm wrong, but NATO membership is excluded apparently for a longer time to come. So the EU is the only real perspective a sovereign, independent Ukraine can have. And I'm not sure if we are strong enough to support Ukraine on that very difficult, complicated, and expensive way.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think if you ask for Germany, what the lessons are, and Russia partly helped them learn the lesson by cutting off gas supplies in the fall of 2022, is, do not become so dependent on one single country supplying, energy that, everybody needs in order to continue their lives, particularly with an unpredictable, what turned out to be an actually very unpredictable dictator, even though people may not have thought that at the beginning. And I think the other kind of general lesson is, carrots and sticks don't work with Russia, because, Russia eats all the carrots. In other words, offering incentives really has not, was not able to moderate Russian behavior. Putin doesn't respond to flattery. He's impervious to that, and he's pretty impervious to more direct threats unless one follows through with them. So it's necessary to have a consistent policy of pushing back against what the Russians are doing. I mean, clearly, in terms of Ukraine, as Katja said, it's very difficult. I mean, the first challenge is to actually come to achieve a ceasefire. The Trump administration has tried diplomacy, which, of course, the Biden administration really didn't, and most European governments, including Germany, after the full-scale invasion didn't. But we see what's happened. Putin has absolutely made no compromises. His maximalist demands, which would amount to the dismantlement of Ukraine as a sovereign, independent state, he hasn't changed those at all. And so one can try diplomacy, but there are really limits because of this mission that Katja has already said. He seems to have a messianic vision of restoring Russia as a great power, restoring the Russian Empire, looking to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. And so at the moment, what you can do is try and contain Russian ambitions as much as you can try and support Ukraine as much as you can, but it's going to be very difficult, even if we do achieve a ceasefire along the current lines of contact. How do you enforce it? How do you reconstruct Ukraine? How can you ensure that the next Russian invasion doesn't happen quickly? So these are all, I mean, I think all of the governments, Germany and all of the European governments, with the exception of Hungary and probably Slovakia, have realized this. But I think many people believe that as long as Vladimir Putin is in power in the Kremlin, it's going to be very difficult, to resume any kind of meaningful dialogue, and even to stop the war, which could go on for some time.
And yet there are a number of people who keep saying we have to think about a time after the war in Ukraine. We have to think about a time after Putin, and tried to develop a constructive relationship with Russia. And so I think on the one hand, it's a hard time, it's difficult to reconcile that Russia will likely remain adversarial for many years to come, as you said. And on the other, what that future can look like. And so it is a big question of in the midterm to the long term, beyond sort of immediate crisis management, beyond a sanctions policy, how the government in Berlin can try to prevent further escalation, but also manage that coexistence with the war in the background. I mean, I'm wondering, Katja, if you have any insights on how the Merz government is trying to manage that and navigate that. And Angela, is a long time observer of Russia, what are maybe some recommendations that you would make to policymakers as they try to grapple with this?
Nothing is wrong with dialogue and contacts, especially when it comes to crisis management, also in the military realm. I don't see ways to rebuild a constructive relationship with Russia for the time being, except of crisis management, and keep a couple of channels open, keep a couple of back channels open. Nothing is wrong with this, because times are really dangerous and things can escalate very quickly. I mean, we all remember drones over Poland. We remember MiG-31s over the NATO country of Estonia recently. So try and, to kind of manage that major crisis is already would already be a big achievement. Germany knows exactly that without the American administration, without the American president, there's not really a lot they can do when it comes to further support Ukraine on all the fronts where Ukraine needs to be supported. You've been following the issue of these at least 140 billion euros of frozen Russian assets, and whether to find a way to use these assets to give a bigger loan to Ukraine, because money is running out for many European countries, and it's not a given that Germany can take this on for a long time to come. I think we will do our really very best. But it's not forever. It's not endless capacity. And Putin knows this very well.
So I would just, say one of the difficulties with dealing with Russia during this war, and I'm going to go back to the former German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who refused to meet with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, during, I think, a United Nations session. And she said, I'm not going to talk to him because he lies all the time. I mean, the problem is, even if you try and have a dialogue with the Russians, when they bomb hospitals in Ukraine, they deny that they bombed them. They've never admitted their responsibility for the MH17 air crash, which Katja talked about. So it's very difficult, even to pursue a minimal dialogue when when your interlocutors distort facts and don't admit to what's happening. Now you do still have to try and talk to them, but I think I think at the moment, if I'm now putting on my hat sitting in Washington, I think the imperative is for the Trump administration to remain involved in this, and to recognize, when Putin is not serious about negotiations, and to keep putting pressure on Russia. And so, we do have these sanctions now, the oil sanctions. That there may be the supply of more effective weapons to Russia. The Tomahawk issue is at the moment, not going ahead, but at the moment, for the time being, putting pressure on Russia to force Putin to the negotiation table would be is the most important thing. Looking out over the future, yes, of course, you have to think about dealing with a Russia post-Ukraine war and post-Putin and having constructive relations. But at this point, that it's not clear that what comes after Putin is going to be that different from what we have now, although you won't have the person of Vladimir Putin, and you won't have such a personalistic system. And I think that's why it's such a challenge to think about what to do in a few years, or when you have a different government in Russia. But for now, the imperative is to try and stop the killing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, this is obviously something all of us need to have our eyes on, and something that will continue to emerge and continue to unfold. For now, I'd like to thank both of you for sharing your insights. And Katja, I'd like to particularly thank you and Georg for writing this book, which has revealed, I think, a lot of new information that people are very interested in hearing about and learning about, and has shed just some new insights into Germany's Russia policy.